The morning sun cast long shadows across the twisted metal and scorched concrete of Pearl Harbor as Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over his desk, surrounded by stacks of intercepted Japanese messages. It was late April 1942, and the cryptanalyst hadn't seen his family in weeks. His uniform was wrinkled and his eyes bloodshot, but his mind was sharper than ever. He could feel something big was coming, sensing it in the patterns of enemy communications and the increased radio traffic flowing through Station Hypo like a river about to burst its banks. Outside his windowless office in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building, the Pacific Fleet was a shadow of its former self. 4 battleships lay on the harbor bottom, hundreds of aircraft had been destroyed, and more than 2,000 Americans had died on that infamous December morning. The Japanese had struck with precision and overwhelming force, leaving America's Pacific defenses in ruins. But Rochefort knew something they didn't. The Americans weren't beaten. They were learning, adapting, and preparing to strike back. "Sir, another intercept from the Japanese Fourth Fleet," said one of his cryptanalysts, placing a freshly decoded message on Rochefort's cluttered desk. The young officer's face showed the strain of endless hours wrestling with the enemy's naval code. "They're requesting additional supplies for something called Operation MI." Rochefort's tired eyes suddenly blazed with intensity. For weeks his team had been tracking fragments of a massive Japanese operation, one that would dwarf even Pearl Harbor. But where and when? The coded designation AF appeared repeatedly in the intercepts, taunting them with its mystery. If they could crack this puzzle, they might turn the tide of the entire war. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood at the window of his headquarters, watching salvage crews still working to raise the sunken battleships. The white-haired Texan had taken command of the Pacific Fleet at its darkest hour, inheriting a demoralized force and an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Behind him, his intelligence officer, Commander Edwin Layton, cleared his throat nervously. "Admiral, Rochefort's team believes they've identified a pattern in the Japanese communications. Something major is being planned for early June. The scale suggests it's their largest operation since the war began." Nimitz turned from the window, his ice-blue eyes fixed on Layton. The admiral had learned to trust his intelligence officers, even when their conclusions seemed impossible. Unlike many senior commanders who dismissed codebreaking as unreliable guesswork, Nimitz understood that information was the most powerful weapon in modern warfare. "How certain are they?" Nimitz asked, his voice carrying the weight of command. Every decision he made could mean life or death for thousands of sailors and Marines. "Rochefort stakes his career on it, sir," Layton replied without hesitation. "He believes the target is somewhere in the Central Pacific. His team is working around the clock to pinpoint the exact location." The admiral nodded slowly. If Rochefort was right, this could be the opportunity they desperately needed. The Japanese had been advancing across the Pacific like a tidal wave, capturing island after island, building an empire that stretched from the home islands to the shores of Australia. But every empire had its limits, and perhaps the enemy was finally overreaching. Down in the cryptanalysis center, Rochefort's team worked with feverish intensity. The basement room was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale coffee. Banks of IBM tabulating machines clattered endlessly, sorting through thousands of code groups. Men and women in rumpled uniforms pored over worksheets, searching for patterns in the seemingly random characters. "I've got something," announced Lieutenant Commander Wesley Hamwright, one of Rochefort's top cryptanalysts. "The Japanese keep referencing water desalination equipment for AF. Why would they need special water supplies for a major naval base?" Rochefort's tired eyes suddenly blazed with intensity. The pieces clicked into place. A location that would need additional water supplies, somewhere strategically important enough to warrant a massive operation. His mind raced through the possibilities, and suddenly he knew. It had to be Midway, the tiny American atoll that guarded the approaches to Hawaii. One of his subordinates, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, proposed an ingenious plan. "What if we have Midway report water supply problems? If the Japanese mention it in their coded traffic, we'll know AF is Midway." Get me a secure line to Layton. Tell Midway to send an emergency message in plain language saying their water distillation plant has broken down." Meanwhile, aboard the carrier USS Enterprise, Admiral William Bull Halsey lay in sickbay, his body ravaged by a severe case of dermatitis. The aggressive commander who had led the early carrier raids against Japanese-held islands was now too ill to stand. His task force was about to sail into the most important battle of the war, and he wouldn't be leading it. "Bill, you look like hell," said Admiral Raymond Spruance, visiting his old friend. The two men were opposites in many ways. Halsey was bold and instinctive, while Spruance was calculating and methodical, but they shared a deep respect for each other and an unshakable determination to defeat Japan. "Bill, I'm giving you my command," Halsey said weakly. "Take my boys and hit those bastards hard. They trust you, and so do I." Spruance nodded solemnly. He had never led carriers in combat before, but he understood the principles of naval warfare better than almost anyone. More importantly, he knew how to listen to his subordinates and make decisions based on facts rather than emotion. These qualities would soon be tested in ways no one could imagine. On Midway itself, Marine Colonel Harold Shannon inspected his ragtag collection of aircraft. The tiny atoll's air group was a mixed bag of obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, already proven inferior to the Japanese Zero, alongside a handful of newer Wildcat fighters and various bombers. His pilots were mostly green, fresh from training with little combat experience. "Colonel, are we really expected to stop the Japanese Navy with these?" asked Major Lofton Henderson, gesturing at the lined-up Buffaloes. The Marine aviator knew the reputation of these planes, nicknamed flying coffins by their pilots. "We'll stop them or die trying," Shannon replied grimly. "Every minute we can delay them gives the Navy a better chance to hit their carriers. That's our job, Major. Buy time with everything we've got." Back at Pearl Harbor, confirmation came through that electrified Rochefort's team. Japanese intelligence had reported in their coded messages that AF was experiencing water shortages. The target was definitely Midway. Armed with this crucial intelligence, Nimitz called his senior commanders to an urgent meeting. "Gentlemen, we know where they're going and approximately when. The Japanese are sending at least 4 carriers to attack Midway in early June. This is our chance to ambush them." Captain Miles Browning, Halsey's chief of staff, who would now serve under Spruance, studied the intelligence reports. "Sir, our pilots are reporting at least 6 Japanese carriers operational. If they bring them all, they'll—" Nimitz interrupted with quiet confidence. "Our intelligence indicates they're splitting their forces. 2 carriers are heading for the Aleutians as a diversion. That leaves 4 for Midway, and we'll be waiting with 3. The mathematics were still daunting. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. Their pilots were the best in the world with years of combat experience. The American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, had brave crews but far less experience. Moreover, Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea and was limping back to Pearl Harbor. "How long to repair Yorktown?" Nimitz asked, turning to his maintenance officer. 3 months minimum, Admiral. She took bomb hits that went deep into her structure. There's significant damage to her flight deck and fuel systems." "You have 3 days," Nimitz said flatly. "Whatever it takes, I want that ship operational and sailing with the others." The maintenance officer's jaw dropped, but he saw the determination in Nimitz's eyes. "Yes, sir, we'll work around the clock." As May drew to a close, Pearl Harbor became a hive of desperate activity. 1,400 workers swarmed over Yorktown, welding, hammering, and installing new equipment. Repairs that should have taken months were compressed into 72 hours of superhuman effort. Men worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, knowing that every rivet they drove, every plate they welded, might make the difference between victory and defeat. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch, one of the Navy's premier fighter tacticians, gathered his pilots aboard Yorktown. He had developed new tactics specifically to counter the superior maneuverability of the Japanese Zero, which had dominated every aerial engagement so far. "Listen up," Thatch addressed his young aviators. "The Zero can outturn us, outclimb us, and it's faster, but it's lightly built. Our Wildcats can take punishment and keep flying. We're going to use a new formation I call the Tatch Weave. Work in pairs, cover each other, and never try to dogfight a zero one-on-one. Among the pilots was Ensign George Gay, fresh from flight school with barely 300 hours of flight time. The young Texan tried to hide his nervousness as Thatch explained how they would attack the Japanese fleet. The torpedo bombers would go in low and slow, perfect targets for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Everyone knew it was practically a suicide mission, but no one voiced their fears. In the intelligence offices, analysts worked to piece together the complete Japanese order of battle. They knew Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was personally commanding the operation. The strike force would be led by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded at Pearl Harbor. The intelligence painted a picture of overwhelming Japanese confidence. They were coming to finish what they started 6 months earlier. "They're coming with everything," reported. That afternoon, 9 B-17s from Midway attacked the invasion convoy but scored no hits. 4 PBYs, equipped with torpedoes, attempted a night attack, claiming 1 hit. While these attacks caused no significant damage, they alerted the Japanese that the Americans knew they were coming. At 0300 on June 4th, reveille sounded aboard the American carriers. In ready rooms, pilots received final briefings and wrote last letters home. Mechanics made final checks on aircraft. Ordnance crews loaded bombs and torpedoes. 3 carriers with barely 230 aircraft were about to take on the pride of the Japanese Navy. The odds were steep, but the Americans had advantages. They knew the enemy was coming. They knew where to find them, and they had commanders willing to take calculated risks. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, in overall command aboard Yorktown, made the decision that would govern American tactics for the coming battle. Rather than keeping his carriers together for mutual protection, he would operate them separately, reducing the risk of all 3 being caught together. It was a gamble, but the entire operation was a gamble on a massive scale. As dawn approached on June 4, 1942, the stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in naval history. The Japanese came in supreme confidence, expecting to catch the Americans by surprise. Instead, they were sailing into a carefully prepared trap. The U.S. Navy, battered but not broken at Pearl Harbor, was about to demonstrate that American determination and ingenuity could overcome even the most daunting odds. At 0300 hours on June 4th, the pre-dawn darkness over Midway was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tamanaga led 108 Japanese aircraft from the 4 carriers toward their target. The attack force included 36 torpedo bombers carrying conventional bombs for ground attack, 36 dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters for escort. As they formed up in the darkness, not one of the Japanese aviators suspected that American carriers lurked nearby, waiting. On Midway, radar operators detected the incoming strike at 0552. Many planes bearing 320 degrees, distance 93 miles, the operator reported, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll. Marines ran to their battle stations, while pilots sprinted to their aircraft. Every flyable plane on Midway had to get airborne immediately or risk destruction on the ground. Major Lofton Henderson led Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 into the dawn sky in their obsolete Buffalo fighters, knowing they were heading into a massacre. The Buffalo was slower, less maneuverable, and more lightly armed than the Zero, but Henderson's Marines had absolute determination to protect their base at any cost. Enemy fighters 12 o'clock high. The radio crackled with warnings as the Marines met the incoming strike force head-on. The Zeros pounced on the American fighters like hawks among pigeons. Within minutes, the sky was filled with burning American planes spiraling toward the ocean. Henderson's aircraft was among those shot down as he led his squadron's dive bombers in their attack. But the Marines' sacrifice wasn't in vain. Their attack disrupted the Japanese formation and forced the bombers to take evasive action. More importantly, it bought precious time for Midway's bomber force to clear the island and head for the Japanese fleet, whose position had been reported by searching PBY patrol planes. At 0630 hours, Tominaga's force reached Midway and began their attack runs. Bombs rained down on the airfield, fuel tanks, and defensive positions. The island's anti-aircraft guns blazed away, filling the sky with black puffs of smoke. A direct hit on the power station knocked out Midway's radar. Another bomb set the fuel tanks ablaze, sending thick columns of smoke into the morning sky. But as Tominaga circled to assess the damage, he realized the attack had failed in its primary objective. The runways were cratered but repairable. Many defensive positions remained intact, and most critically, they had destroyed few aircraft on the ground because the Americans had gotten them airborne in time. Tominaga radioed back to Admiral Nagumo. "There is need for a second attack wave." This message would trigger a chain of decisions that would determine the battle's outcome. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a dilemma. He had held back 93 aircraft armed with shipping weapons, torpedoes, and armor-piercing bombs in case American ships appeared. Should he rearm them with bombs for ground attack for a second strike on Midway, or keep them ready for naval targets? At 0715 hours, Nagumo made his fateful decision: rearm the aircraft with bombs for land attack. Crews immediately began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and replacing them with conventional bombs. It was dangerous work on crowded hangar decks with armed ordnance being moved around volatile aviation fuel and ammunition. Unknown to Nagumo, 200 miles to the northeast, American carriers were already launching their strikes. Admiral Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, had made the crucial decision to launch everything he had at maximum range. It was a calculated risk. His planes would barely have enough fuel to return, but it would catch the Japanese at their most vulnerable. "Pilots, man your planes!" The order echoed across the American flight decks. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, knowing the odds against his slow, vulnerable Douglas TBD Devastators. In his ready room briefing, he had been brutally honest with his men. "If we run out of gas, we'll ditch together. If only one of us makes it through, he'll hit a carrier. May God be with us all." Among Waldron's pilots was Ensign George Gay, the young Texan who would soon become the sole survivor of his squadron. As Gay climbed into his Devastator, he checked his rear gunner's position. Radioman Bob Huntington gave him a thumbs up, trying to mask his own fear with bravado. By 800 hours, the American strike was airborne, but scattered. The different squadrons became separated in the clouds, each group proceeding independently toward the estimated Japanese position. This lack of coordination would prove both a weakness and, paradoxically, a strength in the coming engagement. Meanwhile, Nagumo's problems were multiplying. At 0728 hours, a scout plane from the cruiser Tonei finally reported 10 enemy surface ships bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed 20 knots. The pilot hadn't identified ship types, a crucial oversight that left Nagumo uncertain whether he faced carriers or merely a surface force. "Suspend rearming operations," Nagumo ordered, but confusion reigned on the Japanese hangar decks. Some aircraft were fully rearmed, others were half-converted, and ordnance was scattered everywhere in the rush to complete the changeover. The delay would prove fatal. At 0820, the Tonei scout plane sent another report that chilled Nagumo's blood. Enemy ships are accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The Americans had carriers at sea, and his own aircraft are in chaos, caught between configurations. Worse, his first strike wave was returning from Midway, low on fuel and needing to land immediately. The first American attacks came from Midway-based aircraft, Marine dive bombers, and Army B-17s attacking from high altitude. These uncoordinated attacks scored no hits, and the Japanese carriers easily evaded the falling bombs. Zero fighters slaughtered the Marine planes, but each failed attack forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver, delaying flight operations. At 9:20 hours, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron spotted the Japanese fleet through breaks in the clouds. His torpedo squadron was alone, having become separated from the fighters and dive bombers. Waldron knew attacking without fighter cover was suicide, but he also knew this might be their only chance. "Attack immediately," Waldron ordered, leading his 15 Devastators down toward the Japanese carriers. The Zeros were waiting. As the slow torpedo bombers lumbered toward their targets at wave-top height, the Japanese fighters attacked ferociously. One by one, the Devastators burst into flames and crashed into the sea. Ensign Gay watched in horror as his squadron mates died around him. Waldron's plane was hit and cartwheeled into the ocean. Others exploded in midair or broke apart under the concentrated fire. Gay pressed on, his gunner, Huntington, firing desperately. As news of the victory spread, America erupted in celebration. After 6 months of defeat and retreat, the United States had won its first major victory against Japan. The road to Tokyo would be long and bloody, but Midway proved it could be traveled. The Japanese Navy, which had seemed invincible since Pearl Harbor, had been decisively beaten by a smaller American force. In Japan, the government hid the extent of the defeat from the public. Returning sailors were isolated to prevent word from spreading. The official story claimed a great victory, but the Navy knew the truth. The offensive phase of Japan's war was over. From now on, they would be on the defensive, trying to hold what they had conquered against an increasingly powerful American counteroffensive. The Battle of Midway became a turning point, not just in the Pacific War, but in world history. It demonstrated that intelligence, properly used, could overcome numerical disadvantage. It showed that courage and sacrifice, even in apparent failure, could create opportunities for victory. Most importantly, it proved that the United States had the will and capability to defeat even the most formidable enemy. Admiral Nimitz, in his after-action report, gave credit where it was due, to the codebreakers who had uncovered the Japanese plan, to the commanders who had made crucial decisions under pressure, and above all, to the pilots who had pressed home their attacks against overwhelming odds. But he also recognized the role of chance in war. Had the American dive bombers arrived 5 minutes later, after the Japanese had launched their strikes, the outcome might have been very different. The Japanese Navy would never recover from Midway. The 4 carriers lost represented years of construction and decades of pilot training that could not be replaced. While Japan would commission new carriers, they would never again achieve the combination of ships, aircraft, and experienced air crews that had made their early victories possible. For the young American pilots who survived, Midway was a defining moment. Men like Dick Best, who had placed the bomb that doomed Akagi, would continue flying throughout the war, but nothing would match the intensity of those few minutes over the Japanese fleet. Others, like Ensign Gay, would carry the memory of fallen comrades for the rest of their lives. The battle also marked a revolution in naval warfare. For the first time, a major naval engagement had been fought entirely by aircraft, with the opposing fleets never coming within sight of each other. The age of the battleship was ending. The aircraft carrier was now the dominant weapon of naval warfare. In the broader context of World War II, Midway was America's Stalingrad, the point where a seemingly unstoppable advance was not just halted, but reversed. Combined with the grinding attrition of Guadalcanal that would follow, it marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. The industrial might of America, fully mobilized for war, would produce ships and aircraft in quantities Japan could never match. The veterans of Midway would go on to fight in the Solomons, the Philippines, and eventually to the doorstep of Japan itself. They had learned that the Japanese could be beaten, that American training and equipment, properly employed, were more than a match for enemy skill and determination. For Japan, Midway exposed the fatal flaw in their strategic planning. They had begun a war against an enemy with 10 times their industrial capacity, believing that spiritual superiority could overcome material disadvantage. The Americans had shown at Midway that they possessed both material strength and the will to use it. The codebreakers who had made victory possible received little public recognition during the war. Their work remained classified for decades. But officers like Rochefort and his team had arguably won the most important intelligence victory in American history. By solving the puzzle of AF and predicting Japanese movements, they had given Nimitz the information needed to position his forces perfectly. Lieutenant Commander Rochefort, despite his crucial role, would be reassigned shortly after Midway due to bureaucratic conflicts with Washington. His team's success had proven that intelligence could win battles, but inter-service rivalries would prevent him from receiving proper recognition until decades later. In 1986, he was posthumously awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. As the years passed, Midway took on almost mythical status in American military history. It became the textbook example of how intelligence, courage, and tactical excellence could combine to achieve victory against superior forces. Military academies around the world studied the battle, seeking to understand how the Americans had achieved such a complete reversal of fortune. The human dimension of Midway should never be forgotten. Behind the strategic movements and tactical decisions were individual acts of heroism that determined the outcome. The Marine pilots who flew obsolete fighters against Zeros, the torpedo bomber crews who pressed their attacks without fighter cover, the dive bomber pilots who searched past the point of safe return, the damage control parties who saved ships, all contributed to victory. The Battle of Midway proved that democracies could fight and win against totalitarian enemies. The American carriers were crewed by citizen sailors, many of whom had been civilians just months before. They faced an enemy with years of combat experience and a tradition of victory. Yet when the moment came, these Americans performed with skill and courage that matched anything in their nation's history. The lesson of Midway resonates beyond its historical moment. It reminds us that apparent weakness can be turned to strength through intelligence and determination, that sacrifice, even in failure, can create opportunities for others, that technological superiority means nothing without the will to use it effectively, and that free nations, when threatened, can summon the courage to defend themselves against any odds. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, the tide of the Pacific War had turned decisively. The Japanese would fight on with characteristic determination for 3 more years, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. At Midway, A smaller American force had destroyed the heart of Japanese naval power and seized the initiative. Admiral Yamamoto's pre-war prediction had proven prophetic. He had warned that he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that, I have no confidence. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The architect of Japan's early victories had understood that once America recovered and mobilized its strength, Japan's defeat was inevitable. At Midway, that inevitability became reality, written in the burning hulks of 4 aircraft carriers and the sacrifice of brave men who fought and died for their nations in the vast Pacific sky. The impact of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. It demonstrated that the United States could gather intelligence, plan operations, and execute complex naval battles with precision. The coordination between codebreakers, planners, and combat forces had created a new model for modern warfare. Future operations would build on these lessons, combining intelligence gathering with tactical execution. For the individual sailors and airmen who fought at Midway, the battle represented a personal triumph over fear and adversity. Young men who had never seen combat performed acts of extraordinary courage. Mechanics worked through exhaustion to keep planes flying. Damage control teams saved ships that should have sunk. Radio operators maintained communications under fire. Each person's contribution, no matter how small, had helped achieve victory. The Japanese pilots and sailors who fought at Midway also displayed remarkable courage and skill. Despite the disaster that befell their carriers, they fought with determination until the end. Many chose death over surrender, going down with their ships or flying their damaged aircraft into the sea rather than be captured. Their sacrifice, though in a losing cause, reflected the warrior tradition that had made them such formidable opponents. In the aftermath of Midway, both navies would apply the lessons learned. The Americans would refine their carrier tactics, improve their aircraft, and develop better torpedoes. The Japanese would struggle to rebuild their carrier forces and train new pilots to replace those lost, but the fundamental shift in momentum could not be reversed. America's industrial production would soon flood the Pacific with new ships and planes, while Japan's resources dwindled. The Battle of Midway stands as one of history's most decisive naval